Welcome to the InfoSec Insider podcast, brought to you by URM, the UK's leading information and cybersecurity specialists.
Hi, my name's Annie and I'm here today with Martin Brazier, who's one of our senior data protection consultants at URM. Welcome to another episode of InfoSec Insider Talk DP. So today Martin and I are going to be looking at the data protection considerations for artificial intelligence. So to start with, Martin, bit of a big question for you here, but what is artificial intelligence?
There is a long and rather impenetrable definition of artificial intelligence in the reasonably new EU AI Act, which doesn't apply in the UK. But there isn't really an agreed legal definition of AI in the UK. And that's not least because it can cover a wide scope of technology, much of which isn't actually AI. Typically, it includes those systems that learn from data sets rather than simply following a list of pre-programmed rules or instructions. Most implementations of AI involve a two-stage process, with the first stage being a training, development, or learning phase, whereby the system looks at a data set, often a very large data set, to determine its characteristics. The second is a production or deployment stage, where the system is asked to produce outcomes from the learning it's made in the first stage. Both stages serve different purposes, both can process personal data, and both present different data protection challenges. But as the reactions are learned and not programmed, how that system has reached a conclusion might not be entirely clear. It operates in what's often called a black box. And this underlying characteristic produces difficulties when achieving data protection compliance, which you don't get in traditional personal data processing. And this can include some opacity about the source of the original learning data, bias, which is introduced through reliance on the original data or through algorithms, and inadvertent use of personal data or intellectual property.
And how is the regulatory framework for AI evolving?
Well, in the UK, the government produced a white paper in March of 2023 entitled a pro-innovation approach to AI regulation, which focused on adopting and adapting existing legislation and regulatory regimes instead of the EU's more prescriptive and legislative-driven approach in the EU AI Act. In August of the same year, a House of Commons report suggested that the white paper's approach risked the government being left behind by the EU's more prescriptive act, and proposed an AI bill to be included in the King's Speech on November the 7th in 2023, although that recommendation wasn't taken up. The government's intention seems to be to provide oversight via the Information Commissioner's Office and other regulatory bodies, including Ofcom and the Financial Conduct Authority. And it's worth noting at this stage that the ICO's role has changed slightly by the recent Data Use and Access Bill, but not so significantly that it wouldn't remain as a regulator. The ICO issued guidance on how to use AI and personal data in late 2022, around the time that it collaborated with the Alan Turing Institute to issue a paper on explaining decisions made with AI. And as a result, the ICO issued guidance in March of 2023. So in a way, AI is a new problem for already established requirements. And we need to look at the key aspects of data protection that AI causes us to consider in a different way. Some of the established AI services, ChatGPT, Bing AI, and so on, use large language models to generate text in response to an input from a series of questions or instructions. The service then provides answers drawing on its learning from the large language model through a process of recognizing, predicting, and generating content. One of the initial risks is that personal data may be included in that large language model, which will find its way into the generated input. And the mainstream AI services are infamously vague about the origins of those data sources. So the users of the output may never realize that their output contains or was generated from personal data or information forming the intellectual property of others. And also, if personal data is included in any request for output from an AI service, that input might well be used to recycle and help the model to learn again.
Brilliant. Thank you, Martin. Next, could you just talk us through what the UK GDPR principles are and how they apply to AI?
Well, I'll very quickly look at some of the principles in detail. And the first one is about fairness and lawfulness. And to process personal data, you've got to have an appropriate lawful basis. As the use of AI involves two processing stages, i.e. the training and production stages, this means ensuring that there's a lawful basis for each type of processing, and the lawful basis may be different for each stage. If the proposal involves processing special category data, which would be information about the health, race, religious beliefs, biometrics, politics, sexual life and sexual orientation, and so on, there is a need to identify an additional lawful basis under Article 9. One potential Article 9 basis is explicit consent, but there's clear difficulties in acquiring explicit consent in practice, given the challenges of explaining how AI would process an individual's personal data, and more of this in a minute. However, this may be the only option. For example, if there's no substantial public interest, such as the prevention or detection of crime, then you may have to rely on that. Furthermore, there are likely to be considerations of necessity and proportionality and context. Context, after all, is everything. As understanding AI is impenetrable to many people, ensuring that the process is fair can be a challenge, not least because fairness centres around processing data only in a manner which individuals would reasonably expect. It remains an issue that AI systems can reflect bias in learning data sets or create bias where none previously existed. It can perpetuate bias that stems from the learning data or programming algorithms. Therefore, it's important to ensure that the system is sufficiently accurate and thoroughly tested for bias before implementation. The second principle is about transparency, and the legislation requires a controller to inform data subjects what information they hold about them and how they are using it. So the complexity of understanding how AI systems work and how they might process personal data translates into a perceived lack of transparency, which can make it difficult for controllers to explain those decisions to data subjects if the algorithm and the data sources are as opaque as we've suggested they might be. The ICO has recognized the difficulty of explainability and has produced guidance in the collaboration with the Alan Turing Institute. The EU's Article 29 Working Party has some guidelines on automated individual decision-making and profiling, said that the process of profiling is often invisible to the data subjects, and it works by creating derived or inferred data about individuals, which is effectively new personal data that has not been provided directly by the data subjects themselves. Individuals have different levels of comprehension, and they may find it challenging to understand the complex techniques involved in profiling and automated decision-making processes. In certain circumstances, the right to be informed can be waived if the data wasn't collected from the data subject. So, for example, if it can be demonstrated that informing data subjects is impossible or requires disproportionate effort. However, for the exercise of rights, including the right related to automated decision-making, it's essential to provide detailed explanations to the data subject. even if the regulators recognise the difficulty in explaining AI processing, there is nonetheless an obligation for controllers to provide as full a description as possible about the source of information and how any outcomes have been derived in the plainest possible language. The next principle worth looking at is the purpose limitation principle, which requires that personal data must only be collected for specified, explicit, and legitimate purposes and not processed further. Learning data for AI can be collected through a process called data scraping or web scraping, where data from various sources is compiled on a huge scale and may, for example, include sources from social media and the internet in general. Due to the almost indiscriminate nature of this process and its sheer scale, personal data will be included without any record that it's been included at all. And it may also collect data which is untrue or inaccurate or which forms the intellectual property of others. Consequently, this method is almost the exact opposite of what is required to comply with the purpose limitation principle. And the legislation also requires the processing of personal data to be adequate, relevant, and limited to what is necessary. The data minimization principle. The nature of compiling huge data sets for learning models means that, again, this process is at the opposite end of the scale from only processing what is necessary and no more. This is particularly troublesome where the data set includes special category data. The legislation also requires that any personal data needs to be accurate and, where necessary, kept up to date. As data is collected in such large volumes for learning models, it's not always possible for it to be verified or checked in any way. Moreover, the data, once it's in the model, may be unrecognizable and very difficult to correct. Inaccurate information, personal data or otherwise, and information which introduces or produces bias is one of the main issues with commercial AI chatbot services. We should also look at the stories limitation principle, which says that personal data must be kept in a form which allows identification of data subjects for no longer than is necessary. Again, as with the accuracy principle, this is difficult to achieve with many AI models. However, provided the controller can justify longer retention periods for data in the learning systems, which is proportionate to the purpose of the AI system, there's no reason why data couldn't be kept longer than would be the case in a conventional scenario. And whilst it's not strictly a principle, the accountability principle says there's a need to maintain good records from the beginning of the development, which will not only enable a controller to demonstrate compliance, but will help to explain the processing to data subjects and regulators.
Amazing. Thank you, Martin. Lots of challenges to think about in there. So what are the GDPR aspects outside of the principles that need to be considered in terms of AI?
Well, first of all, we'll have a look at automated decision making. And if an AI model is intended to make automated decisions about individuals, and we've heard about AI, for example, being used in healthcare, further challenges are presented because as the law currently stands, data subjects have a right not to have decisions made about them purely by automated means on the basis that important decisions, such as for a mortgage or a job application, shouldn't be handled entirely by an algorithm. The first hurdle is that you must tell data subjects about the automated decision making and how it works, which brings us back to the issues of transparency and explainability inherent in such a complex process. One solution is human intervention, requiring a human to ratify a decision made by the model. But with the complexity of AI systems and their data sources, would it be possible for a human to make an informed and meaningful assessment about whether the model's decision was correct? An alternative solution is to undertake the automated decision-making with the data subject's consent. But again, this involves explaining the decision-making process so that the consent is fully informed. The recent Data Act that's just been approved through Parliament has proposals to make changes to the rules on automated decision making, whereby it's lawful to make automated decisions in some predefined circumstances, and the Secretary of State has the ability to define what those circumstances are. The door might be slightly ajar for purely automated AI decision making for at least some purposes. It's also worthwhile looking at data subject rights, because AI services present problems with the practicalities of meeting those rights, such as the right of access, rectification, erasure, and so on, because personal data in AI models is often difficult to identify and extract. Also, the rights apply to both the personal data contained in the learning model and those contained in the output of production. To avoid arriving at a place where data subject rights can't be met, the principle of data protection by design and default should be adopted, with the exercise of rights built into the solution at the early stage.
Amazing. Thanks, Martin. So finally, and I think this is sort of the biggest question of them all, what should be considered to achieve data protection compliance in AI systems?
I think one of the most significant risks associated with AI is the rather obvious speed of change, and data controllers are rushing to deploy the benefits of AI. Many controllers are outsourcing the development of AI systems to specialist third-party developers, not always with properly developed detailed system specifications, which results in only the developers understanding how they work. Contracts that ensure lasting ownership of specifications, intellectual property, patents, and support could become critical as small software firms are acquired and absorbed into bigger firms as the industry progresses. There are AI systems which learn continuously, where data used or produced in production is fed back into the learning model to improve learning and effectiveness, as we mentioned earlier. There are risks that some of the key characteristics will creep, introducing or worsening any bias and the deterioration of the accuracy of the output. This arises from the use of the same data for two purposes, that for which the system is intended to use in production and the intrinsic improvement of the learning model. This requires a continuous monitoring and assessment regime which can detect issues early on and identify improvements is needed. It's necessary for validating the learning phase with the aim of verifying objectively that the learning performs in the way it was designed to and is suitable for deployment into the production phase. It also minimises the risks of scope creep over time, particularly if the profiles of the individuals whose personal data make up the learning data is different from those at which it's aimed in production. It also ensures that the system in production meets the operational requirements for which it was designed, because the quality of the learning data is no guarantee of good quality in production. There is a need to determine the data necessary to train the system and not to rely on a more is better approach. The quality of the learning data must be balanced against the purpose of the system in production and in line with the proportionality principle. So some things to think about when building a learning data set are deciding whether the personal data is necessary for the model, whether it can be anonymized or pseudonymized, or whether filtering or masking mechanisms could be used. You should be distinguishing between data for the learning and production phases. Documenting the process is necessary in line with the accountability principle, including the sources of the data, how it's being compiled, and the verification of the data's integrity. Should be regularly reassessing for any privacy risks of the data subjects in line with their rights under law, and being vigilant with information security. Despite the new and unique data protection challenges posed by AI, it doesn't necessarily mean that the deployment of compliant AI systems isn't possible, but it does mean that those new risks should be mitigated appropriately. And those mitigations might include testing the system on a reliable data set with the outcomes analysed to make sure that they're commensurate with the objectives and indeed the law. In the rush to completion, developers need to be certain that learning data sets have been established from lawfully obtained data processing. It also includes sampling outputs from the system to be reviewed on an ongoing basis to confirm the quality of the outcome, particularly where they are fed back into the learning data set. Should be adding confidence limits on outcomes with associated flags for any outcomes which exceed those predetermined limits. Providing quality responses in reaction to automated decisions which explain the process and why the decision has been made. So, for example, if a mortgage application is rejected, the feedback could be that the application would have been accepted had the loan amount been lower by X amount, or the applicant's income had been higher by Y amount. There's a need to be building in the ability for human understanding and intervention in the outcomes, and training those analysing outputs to understand how the model derives them. And there's always an opportunity of learning from others. For example, there are controls required for algorithmic trading by financial services firms in the Markets and Financial Instruments Directive. Always handy to look at how other sectors are doing it. So at the earliest stage, a description of how the system works needs to be written in the plainest possible language, including the source of the learning data, its accuracy or output, and the mitigations in place to avoid bias, error, and discrimination. Focus groups could be used to test out the explanation so that it can be used with confidence when presenting it to employees, in data subjects, and indeed the regulator. Data protection impact assessments are mandatory for high-risk processing, and the process will be familiar to data protection officers. The DPIAs provide an essential template to record the risks, mitigations, and design thought processes. If the lawful basis is legitimate interest, then a legitimate interest assessment will be essential. It comprises a purpose test to identify the legitimate interest of the processing, a necessity test to consider if that processing is necessary, and a balancing test against the data subject's interests.
Amazing. Thank you so much for that, Martin. And for any of our listeners that want to read up on the topic, we have a blog on our website, urmconsulting.com, which is called Data Protection Considerations for Artificial Intelligence. So go and check that out, and thank you for listening today. If you've enjoyed this podcast, we would really appreciate it if you could spare a moment to leave a rating or review at ratethispodcast.com/InfoSec Insider. To listen to more episodes, you can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and Podbean.
Thank you for listening to URM's InfoSec Insider podcast. For more information, visit our website at urmconsulting.com.